It's been an exciting week here in the US because the World Cup is finally underway. So that got us thinking about the world stage. And particularly with respect to books, what do you lose when you read a translation, or what do you gain when you can speak the native language? There's a joke that starts, what do you call someone who can speak three languages? Trilingual. Two languages, bilingual. One language, American.
American.
Exactly. And I'm fortunate to speak a couple of languages, not quite as well as my co-host here, Ksenija Popovich, but I've been trying to read more in foreign languages recently. So we're going to have that as our conversation for today. And I'm so excited to talk to her because not only does she read books in foreign languages, she's actually written books in other languages. So with that, welcome to Transatlantic Bookmarks. Well, first of all, before we start with today's topic on Lost in Translation, let's echo back to our Women's Prize for Literature discussion, because that, of course, got announced. And we were both really excited about the winner, and it was The Correspondent. So how do you feel about that? Particularly because you read a number of the books that were shortlisted for the award. So what was your perspective on that versus the other books you read?
I did, and I also read a couple of long-listed titles. So I was rooting for The Correspondent big time because it was a book that I enjoyed so much. Like I told you the other time, I have been having a reading crisis this year because I've been reading so much, and yet nothing seemed to make me happy as a reader. There were books that were really high quality books, but they didn't make me feel anything, or they didn't make me feel the right kind of emotions that I want to find in a book. And this one really hit all the right spots. I loved it so much that I actually decided to find myself a pen pal.
How
I have
fun!
not corresponded with anyone in letters since I was, well, since before emails. And I figured, well, there must be a program, something like that, that exists still, because when I was a student here in Montenegro, so we're talking grammar school, I used to have pen friends from around the world. It was something that was encouraged. And I used to write letters, obviously, to my grandparents, to my friends from back home when I was abroad. That was all wonderful. And then at one point it stopped because the internet came along. So Sybil, who is the protagonist of The Correspondent, really, was she Sybil? I think so. Was
I
her
think,
name
yeah.
Sybil? Yes. She inspired me to take up writing real letters, and I found a website where I connected with people, and I just mailed my first letter in probably 35 years a couple of days ago. I don't know how long it's going to take. It went to Germany. They said a week. Let's see if that's true. But
Well, that's
yes,
exciting. My sister is a big letter writer, and one of my concerns with The Correspondent about whether or not it would win the prize was with the epistolary format, it seemed like a very casual book in a way. It was so accessible, so readable, like you said, so enjoyable. You rooted for the character, you were shocked by her, you were wondering about the love angle, all of these things, but it almost felt as if it were too breezy a read to be true literary fiction. So I was thrilled that it won, partly because for me, it was a great example of how you can have great writing also be a great read and not some heavy intellectual experience.
exactly. And I was elated to discover that a book like that found its way because from Steinbeck onward, and he wasn't the only one, but he's my favorite, so I get to say Steinbeck onward. But he proved that you can use simple language to convey beautiful and complex emotions. And I believe that while the author did make it accessible, and the prose is, as you say, breezy at times because it mimics natural speech patterns, the way people write emails. It's very authentic in that way, but I feel that it confirmed what Steinbeck had set up back then, and many other authors have proved that you don't have to um, use difficult language, difficult prose to convey beautiful things. And she truly did give us a whole spectrum of emotions, of human conditions, of really difficult subjects, because losing a child is, to me, as a mom, the most difficult thing that I could imagine. It's so hard and painful, just the thought of it, that it becomes unfathomable, and yet it happens to so many women. And the way she connects to people, even though she's a bit callous at times, the way a person who has dedicated her life to writing letters is going to adapt to the idea of losing her eyesight. So there are so many nuances, and there is so much character growth, that to me the correspondent managed to tick all the boxes that I want to see ticked to call something great literature. And she did it with so much charm, and being unapologetically female. As
True.
an author, as a protagonist, that book does not try to be anything other than women's literary fiction, and good for her. She deserved the prize, and I'm so happy. I am sick and tired of books being either very highbrow and very raw in that sense, or being very breezy. Great literature can be thoroughly enjoyable, and this book proved it, and good for her for winning. I am so happy.
Fantastic. I couldn't wait to share the news with you on that one once I've been stalking it all week to see what would win.
Yeah, you sent me the text, and it was crazy because I read that they were going to announce it at 6:30 p.m. and I thought it was 6:30 p.m. American time, because I had no idea that it was a British prize. It was based over there. So I figured, okay, 6:30 p.m., that's past midnight my time. I'll find out in the morning. And then you texted me. You had already discovered. So you got to break the news for me, and I was very happy for that.
Well, apparently
What are
America
you?
doesn't have hegemony on awards, so that's nice to see too.
Yes, and I would be remiss not to comment on the World Cup that you mentioned. You guys could be doing a better job to show hospitality to the fans of the most wonderful sport in the world. And also, just to be clear, it's football, not soccer. Thank you very much. And now tell me, it's played with feet. You don't carry a thing that's not shaped like a ball around, and then one guy gets to kick it once in a while. The whole game is played with feet, and it's football. That
Absolutely.
said,
We
that
can have
said,
a whole diversion on words
yeah.
that mean one thing in British English and words that mean another thing entirely in American English.
Yes, gosh, there was a post that came out on X yesterday about these different terms, and it was a guide for Scotsmen how to behave in America. So it would give them a term that means one thing in Scotland and another thing in America, and then it gave advice like, do not use it for that. It was hilarious,
I
and there
had
was.
a brilliant example of that when I was living in the UK. I was doing a photo shoot for headshots, and so I had different outfits, and I was changing out of a dress into a suit. And I said to the photographer, "Give me just a second. I need to put my pants on." And pants means something very different in the UK than it does in the US.
What?
In
Well,
the
I know it's
US,
trousers, but I don't know what pants is.
underwear.
Oh.
So the photographer turned like 6 shades of
But
white.
isn't that knickers?
Yeah, too, but also pants.
Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
I
that
didn't know
was
that, but the cultural thing is beautiful, and I love there was a video that some guy posted on X this morning. Basically, the Scots have arrived, so they rented a house across the street from him, and they were pissed drunk playing bagpipes at like 5 in the morning because of the time difference. They weren't sleepy, and then and then several hours later, he had another post that he actually went across the street to make friends with them because, if you can't beat them, join them.
exactly.
So he went and he took pictures with them and he had a blast with them and they were all playing bagpipes together or something like that. So yes, you're finally get to feel a bit of our, football World Cup enthusiasm and energy, which is beautiful and very contagious.
Yes, yes,
Just
agreed.
stop kicking referees out and we'll be fine.
Yes, among the many things. But
Anyway,
talking
what are
about
you
that
reading this week? What are you reading?
oh, I picked up The Parable of the Sower. So based on our last conversation, one of my friends who watched our podcast, uh, brought me a book that's been adapted to an opera. So I am just getting going on that one and very much looking forward to reading it. So it's fun to have the podcast exist and new book recommendations come out of it. What about you? What have you started recently?
I'm reading Orbital by Samantha Harvey. I think she too won the Women's Prize for Fiction. This has been a bit of a year for prize winners for me, which is not something I usually do. I actually have the tendency to snub them a little bit, but this
Mhm.
year, for some reason, I'm reading prize winners. It's not going to go on forever because my reading list has some other things waiting, but I was interested in this one. And I want to make an episode out of this, so we will be talking about it soon.
Cool.
It's very interesting. It's about a spaceship that's orbiting the Earth, and it's a day in the life of these astronauts. So not much happens. It's mainly their thoughts, their contemplations, but there is this beauty in the way they get to see and perceive and feel the earth from such a distance when you
Mm.
step away from everything, and it makes you wonder how far do we have to step away to finally see things in a different light and start to put things in their rightful place. But we will be talking about that next time, I think.
Well, foreshadowing of things to come.
Yes.
But getting back to our conversation about the nuance of language, from the time I met you, first of all, it's amazing how many different languages you speak. I know you speak at least four, but I think you might speak five or more. So, how many languages do you speak?
That's a very complicated question, and one that's going to get political in several ways, and it's
Ah,
going to also include your first lady.
oh,
So
interesting.
here's the thing. Yes, so it depends on how you look at it technically. So I speak my native tongue, which is now called Montenegrin,
Hmm.
and I also speak English, Italian, Spanish, and terrible French. However, what happens is I bet you've heard a few times in the media that your first lady speaks 5 or 6 languages. So here is why. If you look at it from that lens, which is technically correct, then I speak 8 languages. I don't speak just five. I don't speak five. So here's why. When we had former Yugoslavia, which was made of Slovenia, I'm going to go in geographical order: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia. And then so those were 6 republics that formed Yugoslavia. And then within Serbia, you had 2 autonomous regions that are Vojvodina, still there, and Kosovo, which has still since become independent. So what happened in former Yugoslavia was that you had Slovenian as a different language.
Mm.
It's kind of a different dialect. If I concentrate very hard, I can understand most of it. If it's written, I can understand almost all of it. But it is a different language. There's an influence of German, an influence of different dialects. Macedonia also has a different language and always did, which was called Macedonian. And then the rest of us, so Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, we had named the language Serbo-Croatian or
Yeah.
Croatian Serb. Dependent, Croatian Serbian,
Do you count
dependent.
that as 2 if you say it
It
one
was
way
just
versus the
one,
other?
but that was the name. And then if you were in Croatia, you said Croatian Serbian. And if you were everywhere else, you said Serbo-Croatian. And then in short, we called it Serbian and they called it Croatian. What happened was that as Yugoslavia fell apart, Croatia renamed its language into Croatian. Bosnia decided to do the same thing, so their official language is Bosnian. So we in Montenegro did the same thing, Montenegrin. The Serbs did not appreciate that. They feel that it's a ridiculous thing to do. It's obviously a political thing to do because we
Sure.
understand each other without needing a dictionary. So it would be as if England, the United States, South Africa, Australia, Canada each decided to name the language they speak with the name of their country. And the language does have some differences. There are different words, as we said earlier. So technically, these are separate languages. So technically, I speak Montenegrin, Serbian, Croatian, Bosnian, and then the foreign languages. But I don't tend to put it like that. I know people who put that in their CV, so it
Wow.
looks like they speak 100,000 languages. You will have people who have very strong patriotic feelings and will get angry if you say it's the same language, but I've never needed a dictionary to read a Croatian book or to read a Serbian book or a Bosnian book, although there is a dialectal difference. But so that's why the question is complicated. So your first lady speaks Slovenian and she speaks former Serbo-Croatian, so she speaks Slovenian, Serbian, Croatian, Montenegrin, Bosnian. English, I guess Italian, probably because she was a model, Italian or French, but that's that's how we get to,
Got it, got it.
pump up our number of spoken languages. So
Well, we'll stick with 5 as kind of the very impressive and at least somewhat descriptive view of how many different languages you speak.
I would say 4.5 because saying that I speak French, counting it as a whole spoken language, I think would do huge injustice to the French because my French is so bad. I can talk about anything in French, but I cannot pull off the accent. I cannot pull off the pronunciation. No,
Yep.
doesn't
All
work.
right.
What about you?
So I speak English, obviously, American.
And you speak it very well, I have to say.
Oh, thank you. And then I also speak French and Italian because I had a mother who was a Latin American studies major, spoke both French and Italian, and was passionate about infusing my sister and me with a love of languages. So I studied French all the way through high school, started Italian at the end of high school, studied Italian through college, but recently started taking some Italian classes again because I wanted to brush up on my Italian since I had a few trips there. And
Bravissima.
so I would say my Italian is maybe point 0.3 versus your point 0.5. It needs some work. But one of the things
Hmm.
when I was in the airport with a little bit of time to kill, I decided to pick up 2 books by my favorite Italian author, Italo Calvino. Since I had started tackling reading books in Italian as part of my classes, and I loved his books. I discovered them in English, but that mix of mystical and
Mm.
reality, and sometimes they're in a short story format, but they're always episodic. Like every chapter could stand alone as a complete book in a number of his works that I've read. And that was definitely one of the things that got me thinking about, what do you lose in translations? How do you respond maybe differently to a book when you're reading it in its native language versus reading a translation? And for me right now, literature in a foreign language is a bit of a stretch. And I'm very excited for some of the tools that can help you read beyond just the dictionary. But I'm also fascinated by authors that write in multiple languages. And you touched on this in one of our recent episodes, Ksenija, where you said you had written your first 2 books, I think, in Montenegrin, And then your most recent book you wrote in English, and I think your new book you're also writing in English, correct?
The new one I'm writing in Montenegrin
Okay.
because writing my third book in English was the most grueling exercise in self-torture I have ever imposed on myself. So my masochism level went through the roof. My idea was that I wanted to try to publish in English, to
Mhm.
find maybe an agent, a publishing house, which I did not succeed in doing. And the idea was, well, let me just do it directly in English, especially since 95% of my reading takes place in English. So I often find myself thinking in English.
Mm.
However, it takes a lot of confidence to write a novel, and especially after you've published already. So writing it in English um, took a lot of second guessing. Is this sentence structure correct? Is it literary sound? Does it work? Is it stylistically okay? And it would have been much easier if I had simply written it in my native language and then translated. So I concluded that I made the work so much longer and more difficult for myself by doing that. And I obviously had to then hire an editor to look through it,
Mhm.
and was very humbled when he said that he was impressed and that it looked like a native had written it. But then there were certain sentence constructions that were not very in line with the spirit of native English. So in that sense, it wasn't the smartest thing I've ever done. But I'm looking not to repeat the mistake this time. I'm writing in Montenegrin, and it's strange because by reading so much in English, I find things coming easier to me sometimes in English, certain thoughts, certain constructions. It's a strange thing.
That's absolutely fascinating. For me, two of the hardest things to grasp or grapple with when I'm tackling a book that's in a foreign language, or even frankly trying to speak in a foreign language, one is nuance. Because in your native language, you just have an expansive vocabulary of things that can convey slight differences in an emotion, in a description. And in French or Italian, my vocabulary is so much more limited that I'm choosing perhaps common words and maybe words that are too strong or too weak. I remember not quite understanding what a particular verb meant when I was going to high school in France and coming home and telling my French mother what I really thought of my physics teacher, and it turned out that verb was a very naughty word and not just a strong conveying of emotion. So you learn things like that. But do you feel like from having grappled with crafting a book in English that you now appreciate the nuance differently, or you've been able to expand the way you write, the emotions, things like that, from having stretched in an entirely different direction with this last book?
I'm very, even though it was difficult, I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I tried it and tested myself. I had already translated my second book into English, so by myself. So that was something that it came naturally to me to be the one to do it, because there was actually a translation of my first novel that nobody ever got to read because I put a stop to it. My editor from here invested a lot of money in a translator. And when I received it, it was this highbrow British English, but a very highbrow register that was so unlike my book that it didn't make sense to me in any way. And I said, this is simply not adequate as stylistically. And I think that the big issue was that it was translated by a native, I think, Serbian speaker.
Mhm.
So it is always better, unless you're the author, if and you're really confident in the foreign language, that the translation be done by somebody who is translating into their native language,
That
from
makes a lot
yours
of
to
sense.
their native. Yes. The other way around, it's never going to be
Yeah.
I don't think it's ever going to be just right.
Yeah, one of the other Italian books I tried to tackle recently was Il cane di terracotta, which is
Uh-huh.
part of the Commissario Montalbano series. So it's a charming set of books about this detective in Sicily who, studies all of the or solves all these different cases. And when I read, if I often read on a Kindle and sometimes with, books in Italian or French, I get the audiobook because often hearing it and reading it, I can translate it in my mind. But boy, this one with a Sicilian dialect, I failed, Kindle failed, Google Translate failed. So I guess I just have to go see if somebody's professionally translated it because tackling tackling a strong dialect. From what I heard from my Italian friends is even some Italians struggle to get that dialect understood. I guess it would be like a super heavy Creole accent here in the US where they actually use different words and almost a different pattern of speech to convey things. But that I'm just so impressed that 1, you can translate your books, 2, you've written in English, and 3, you've managed, at least with Fathers Before Sons, in my opinion, to capture something that feels very natural, flows very seamlessly, and is very readable. I never stumbled over a passage in that book where I thought, "Oh, this feels awkward." I would have written it
Wait,
differently.
let me model it.
Yes. Beautiful. Beautiful.
Fathers before sons. No, but when it comes to Italian, the dialects are very difficult. And for instance, I grew up in Milan. That's where I went to university. My Italian used to be 100 times better than my English. It was impeccable, academic, nuanced Italian. Now I don't have much occasion to speak. So while it's still excellent Italian, and often people cannot even realize that I'm not a native speaker, my vocabulary has become impoverished.
Mm,
And yet I could never understand dialetto milanese
and
from Milan because it's a completely different language. So the situation with Italian is that Italy, until its unification, was comprised of many different little kingdoms, or how do you say principato? How do you say?
Um,
Uh, that's
principalities,
principalities, yes, or dukedoms.
Yep,
Ha.
well done.
So see, so yes, dukedoms or well, anyway,
Counties.
like counties. Yeah. So it was just different areas that spoke different languages. So when Italy became unified, they decided that they wanted to have a unified language. So which language is it going to be? And they opted for Toscano because Toscana was the land of the great authors of Dante, Petrarca, Leopardi, and so on. And it was an issue for a lot of people to learn Italian and to become alphabetized in Italian. And I remember I had a schoolmate. I went to her house and she had a grandma who didn't speak Italian. She understood it, but she couldn't speak it. She only spoke dialetto. And my friend had to translate for me. Uh, and when I went to university in Milan to study foreign languages, I remember in philology, they taught us that Romanian is more similar to Italian than the dialect of Bergamo.
Really?
Yes. Bergamasco is more different than Romanian.
Wow, fast.
So it's fascinating how Italy is a conglomerate of different languages. Now, I do not know 30, 40 years later how much the new generations are managing to preserve the dialects. I believe that they are bound to go extinct in time, but there will always be these dialectal nuances and expressions that I'm sure will survive. But all this to say, don't worry about the fact that Commissario Montalbano gave you some trouble. It's normal because the dialects are difficult. I know when I'm listening to songs from Napoli, Napoletani, also Napoletano has some expressions that I struggle with.
Yeah.
And then you have Napoletano, Sorrentino, so you have different cities. They all have different accents or pronunciations. And who am I to say anything? So Podgorica is here. Cetinje is 20 minutes away. It's a completely different way of speaking. Nikšić is half an hour away, a completely different accent. Danilovgrad is 15 minutes away. It's a completely different accent. So
Yeah. Think
it's
I would
beautiful.
say
I love it.
California is pretty homogeneous. You'd have to go pretty far. You get some slight inflection differences when you go a little further north or a little further east, but not not a lot of difference in how Californians speak. So you have to get pretty regional or into smaller enclaves and communities or areas that were, let's say, more French inhabited to get truly different dialects than what's spoken in the majority of America. So we don't,
That's interesting.
yeah, we don't really have that nuance. And I think that's part of why, if every state in the US spoke a different language, Americans might study more languages and might speak more languages. But since it's so universal, there's really not a lot of effort. And of course, with school budget cuts and things like that, all of those things get pared back further and further and further. Though I will say a lot of people speak Spanish, and Spanish radio is getting more airplay. So there's probably a stronger tendency to do that. When I was growing up, it was much more French. French was still, I think, viewed heavily as the language of diplomacy from, centuries ago. Really, after we switched from Latin, I think it went to French as the language of the literary, and so there was a heritage of that in terms of school teaching languages in the U.S. But it was very hard to find many public schools that had languages or any earlier than high school, which would be 14, 15 for us. And finding it earlier than that in a public school was almost non existent. So I felt very grateful to be able to grow up learning different languages so that I could appreciate them. But I will say, when I was taking French, one of the books we had to tackle was Swan's Way. That's the translation in English, but it's Du côté de chez Swan in French. And I am not a big one for introspective books. I'm curious to read Orbital that you talked about because Swan's Way is a lot about, his impressions of himself. And I remember tackling this book that felt like it went on for about 1,000 pages on
It did.
tedious details. And so I think maybe that was one of the things that turned me off reading in French a little bit, because I am sure it is a great literary work. I'm curious if you have a perspective on it, but I was probably more of the like bonjour tristesse sort of high school literature at the time, which made sense given my age, as opposed to great works of French fiction. So have you read Swan's Way, and what do you feel about kind of these introspective books?
I'm not a fan, and therefore I have not read any Proust. I have been avoiding it like the plague. I have the whole thing in my in my library, my home library, which is beautiful and huge. It's all there and it's waiting, and I don't know when I'm going to tackle it. I know I will someday. I will tackle it in translation, but introspective books are not my forte, and Orbital is not my kind of book. First of all, I'm not a fan of sci-fi, and secondly, I like for something to happen in a book. Thankfully, it's not a big one. So, and the contemplations are truly beautiful and significant. So I'm glad that I'm reading it, but it's simply not my kind of book. Now, when it comes to reading books in translation, unless you are trying to read, often people ask, how much does the book lose when it's getting translated from the original nuance? If you have a good translation, somebody who knows what they're doing, I think you're better off reading the translation than the original work unless you are truly fluent in that language. Because if you're not truly fluent, you're not going to get the wordplay that the author is applying there. You are not going to get those linguistic nuances that are important for some authors. Now, of course, if you're going to read something fun, something light, then why not? It's a beautiful thing to do and have fun and enjoy it. But if you want to read such grand works as Proust or one of the other masters, then maybe, in my opinion, it would be better to read a translation. There is a big difference between you reading a translation and me reading a translation, because the American publishing industry is the epicenter of the world. New York, when it comes to publishing, is the epicenter. It is unthinkable for me to pick up a book that was published by an American publishing house, and the same goes for Great Britain, and to find a typo in it,
Yeah.
to find a mistake. It doesn't happen because so many people go through this book. There is so much money invested in the making of this book, which is why it's so hard to find a publisher, why it's so difficult to make it, because I read somewhere that it takes them about $100,000 to publish your book between designers, editors, marketers. It's a really big investment. And so these books, these translations are top notch.
Hmm.
Now, move to a country like former Yugoslavia that went through, depends on where you were, either 10 years of war or 10 years of international sanctions. Obviously, everything economically went into crumbles. People think when they put sanctions on a country, that means you're going to pressure people to go through some hardship and they will overthrow their government. They may eventually overthrow the government, but the economical consequences last for generations. So what happened was that our big publishing houses that used to have the big market of Yugoslavia all crumbled. And you have these little houses that will have one editor, copy editor, that goes through the book. Nobody does true editorial work. The translations are paid with embarrassingly low salaries. And so the quality of translations is horrible. And these books are full of typos. They are full of discrepancies. I remember picking up, we had a publishing boom about 20 years ago where newspapers were publishing grand classics and selling them with the newspapers. So everyone was buying these collections
What?
because we were raised to love literature, appreciate literature. And then the 90s came, and the downfall was not only economical, political, and social, it was also cultural. The quality of music just catapulted down, of movies, of everything that was being produced, and therefore of literature too, and of publishing houses. And many people had stopped reading, and then suddenly these books were coming out and everyone was buying them. It was a prestigious thing to have these collections. I'm proud to say I don't have a single one of them. But anyway,
But you have a lot of books. I can vouch for
I
that.
really have a lot of books. You were in my house. I have a lot of books, and that's just the main library. I have several subsidiaries around the house. But I happened, uh, that's also the other fact. It was very hard here to find books in English. So you either stole them from the internet,
Hmm.
bootlegged copies, or you read translations. And I remember getting my hands on a copy of The Grapes of Wrath by Steinbeck. And let me tell you, even Steinbeck does not stand a chance against a bad translator.
Wow.
Because they say a great book will survive any kind of translation. I guarantee you it will not. This was a 2-tome translation, and I don't know, but I'm 100% confident that the first was translated by one person and the second by another, because the names were different. Because you have Rose of Sharon in
Yeah.
the original. So in the first tome, her name is translated one way, and in the second, a second way.
Yeah.
It
That
wasn't even
definitely feels
proofread.
like somebody outsourced the job to 2 people and then cobbled it together at the very
Definitely.
end.
I got through it, took it, threw it in the trash, wrote a blog post about it, and wrote an angry letter to the publisher, which is something I do not do. I'm not an angry letter person. I don't bother. I don't care. But that's how irritated I was. They managed to demolish Steinbeck. And the
Um,
first time I got a chance to get my hands on an English version, and back then, even in Italy, it wasn't so easy. They didn't have everything. It was small selections. And when I read it for the first time in English, the whole world opened up to me.
mm, mm,
And that's when I went on to read Mice and other things that he wrote, East of Eden, etc. But so that's the big difference between you and me from back in the day when it comes to translations. And due to that experience, I have gotten into the habit, which is not a great one, to only read books. I did this for decades, to only read books in languages I understand and only reading them in original languages. Now I'm trying to read more of an international scene because by doing that, I have pushed myself into a niche of
right.
reading just English, just Italian, just Spanish. Not great, not a great thing to do. But when I do, I read English translations of these foreign languages. I will not pick up a translation that's done into Serbian, Montenegrin, Croatian, whatever you want to call it. I'm not going to do it. I still have a lot of prejudice, a lot of mistrust toward it. And to go back to what you said earlier, yes, French was the language of diplomacy. It had taken over after Latin. But it is my belief that the way the English language has managed to establish a hegemony over the world, where anywhere you go in the world, if you speak English, somebody will understand you and be able to talk back to you. That is, with all the things we might not like about America, its foreign policy, and many other issues, culturally, what America has managed to do from the 20th century onward is a thing of beauty and a feat that is deserving of the utmost respect. It is the youngest culture in the Western world. Europe has much older cultures, and yet what it has managed to do is, in my opinion, a testament to what we originally think about when we say American dream.
Mm,
To me, it's not about how much money you're going to make, or if you're going to, but the fact that this nation, what it has built itself into. And I really hope you guys manage to preserve that and to cultivate that because it's something truly worthy of admiration.
definitely agree. There's a lot I love about America. I think there are a lot of things that are challenges, and there are areas where I probably will never agree with certain people, certain policies, but I do think there is an amazing belief that people can overcome their circumstances, that through hard work and effort, great things can be achieved, and that,
Not just belief, there is endless proof that that is true and
yeah,
possible.
yeah. And I think that's the core concept. We talked a lot when I was in the Balkans with you about Western values and free speech being a big one. I think that's always coming under pressure from multiple parties, but that ability to express yourself as an individual, as an artist, whether it's a playwright, an author, a kind of performing arts, visual arts, all of that, being able to be in a culture that has generally looked down on censorship and promoted free speech above um, almost everything else in the country. I think that's led to being a place where art can flourish. And I get very frustrated seeing that come under attack. And that's probably another podcast for another day about some of what's been going on with the book banning. And sometimes I look at the titles and I think, wow, somebody really has stretched to find something objectionable in this book. So that's a teaser for another conversation that we'll have, because it is just shocking to me. I think probably some of my favorite books growing up, I would never have access to if anything that was objectionable to a or might be objectionable to a child suddenly got pulled off the shelves. And certainly a lot of those earmarked passages that we all shared in junior high would never have seen the light of day.
But still, I believe that if any country can push through its challenges, it's the United States. I am a big fan of Europe, as you know. I am a big European patriot and I love Europe and wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. Uh, I love the culture of it. I love the history of it. I love traveling through it. I like everything about it. But at the same time, when I was growing up, there were, the joke you made at the start about Americans not speaking any languages. Well, because they don't have to. People
Right.
speak English. But there were always jokes that Americans weren't as deeply educated as people in Europe were because it's a different school system and it's more oriented toward the practical. So Americans would be more business oriented, more job work oriented. However, I have to say that even though that might be a generic perception, or when you stop people in the street, maybe will it will take a few more attempts to find somebody truly cultured than it would if you stopped somebody in a European city. I often watch those videos where they ask them things that are generic culture and knowledge, and people will get stuck on the silliest stuff. But the American people I met who are intellectuals, they are amazing intellectuals. So those who do get educated and do go through the educational system, it is something to behold. I remember once watching Harvard lecture in philosophy
Mm.
and being mesmerized by how these young people are taught to think for themselves and to think critically. The dilemmas that are posed in front of them and the kinds of arguments they have to make to defend their position, their ability to come up with those arguments, that is something magnificent. And I went through one of the toughest university programs in Europe, which was in the Catholic University of Milan. We were able to cite a lot of authors. We were able to talk about the isms. I call them ism, romanticism, cubism, about the isms. We were able to make these connections. We were very cultured in that sense, but I don't think we were ever taught to reason in the way I saw in that class,
Oh,
and
fascinating.
that was something else. I really envied those kids for having that. I don't know if
Yeah,
that's just Harvard, what you get in other universities, especially when you go to a lower level, but that was something else.
that's fascinating. I think I want to pick up on your comment about drawing connections between different. Let's talk about the isms or different elements, because looking at literature and art in general, visual art in particular, if you don't have a vocabulary of past, let's say, past authors or past artists. I mean, I think about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, where the hand of God and the hand of Adam are coming together. That motif is so prevalent in modern paintings, and it gets carried through that if you don't know about the original, you miss that connection. And I think going back to authors in different languages, that cultural underpinning, when we share kind of Western culture between Europe and America, there is a lot of shared history there and a lot of American history that echoes Western culture in the broader European sense. But one of the big departures for me is when I worked in Asia, because it was the first place I had lived where I didn't speak the language. I couldn't even read the street signs.
Where in Asia were you?
I was in Hong Kong, but I spent a month traveling around China. And at the time, China was still very culturally isolated. This would have been in 1995. So Hong Kong, still a British colony, hadn't reverted to the Chinese, and China still a very closed system to Western tourists. And one of the joys I've had recently is we put the Monkey King opera on the stage here in San Francisco. And what I didn't appreciate is how much of a cultural phenomenon this is. It's like taking one of the totemic books like the Odyssey or the Iliad that everybody's had to study, that everybody's read, that, early childhood books echo. So it's just permeated your whole life, and you don't even realize it, and taking the equivalent of that from another culture and putting it on the stage. The Monkey King has everything from video games and playing cards to high literature. I mean, it's a 100-chapter book. It's one of the canons of Chinese literature. And so that really got me thinking about not only what you lose when you read a book in a different language, but when you don't even have the cultural underpinnings to understand the nuances or how the characters interact. And you mentioned you were reading books that where you could read the language, read them in the language of the author. Have you read many Japanese authors or Chinese authors, Asian authors? And if so, or if not, kind of where do you stand on those? And how do you think about those relative to something where you're deeply steeped in the culture of the author's country and the author's milieu?
I haven't read as much as I would like to. I find myself having difficulty connecting with the characters as much as I would like because I don't know enough about the culture, definitely not as much as I would want to. And I struggled a lot with Murakami. I He's the author I read most when it comes to the Far East, to the Orient, but I never managed to feel those characters very deeply, even though, for instance, the opening passage of Sputnik Love is maybe the coolest opening passage I've ever read, when Sumire falls in love and he describes how she fell in love and what that love was. I recommend you take a look at that. But it's a culture that I would like to get into a bit more. And once I am done with the next 2 or 3 books, because I have a couple of books that are unfinished. I've started them, and then for one reason or another, I put them off, not because I didn't like them. On the contrary, I did very much, but either I had the physical book, life got too busy, I just focused on audiobooks, just different things. One is very big, but once I get through 3 or 4, the next 3 or 4 books, I want to read Pachinko.
Ah.
It was recommended to me so much, and I actually asked my mom to buy it for me when she was in Vienna, because I'm back in Montenegro, so finding physical books is not as easy in English. And from the way this was recommended to me, I said, okay, I want to have this one physically, because once in a while there are books that I want to own. And so I can't wait to read that one, because I know it's a mixture of cultures that come from that whole area, but then I think it's Korea and Japan, but then it's how they integrate into America. So that's something that I'm very curious about, especially now that with the whole immigration debate,
Yeah.
there is also always the debate about assimilation and whether somebody who has more difficulty assimilating into the culture where they come is deserving of coming into that culture. Many people feel that they are not, and that's their main anti-immigration argument. It's the assimilation or not assimilation. As somebody who has lived abroad since I was 11, assimilation is no easy task. When you come somewhere, especially if you don't speak the language well, people already have their friendships, their cliques. They're not eager to invite new people in. You start getting lonely. You obviously then start connecting with people who do understand your language, who come from your country, who understand what you're going through, might help you out with things you don't understand, you don't know. And then before you know it, you are part of that community,
Right.
that immigrant community. And obviously, one has the basic human need of connection. And if that's where you find connection, that's what's going to happen. And then that suddenly becomes disqualifying for you as an immigrant to stay somewhere. So it's very, very difficult for first generation immigrants to assimilate unless they come from a very similar country. And so, okay, I lost my train of thought. Where did I start from to get here?
We were starting from, kind of connecting with characters in books to connecting with
Yes, with
cultures
Japan. Thank you.
and
Thank you. I, I,
the
I
challenge with
have the
that.
tendency to go on a tangent. So I come from a family where we talk a lot. Okay. We're very, very talkative. So
You always do a
sometimes I
good
will
job of
just,
sending me the kind of Balkan teasers and some of the Instagram things that, talk
yes.
about how an Italian views something, an American, a Brit, and then the Balkan version is generally you talk for several hours. You told me the story of your mother or grandmother literally walking to a different town and turning
Oh,
around
okay.
and
So
coming
let me
back.
explain.
So I think
Let
you
me
come from a
explain.
long line and a storied history of people who
I
love
come from a
spinning
long line
tales.
of women who talk a lot. Now, just to be clear, I talk a lot, but compared to my late great grandmother, I'm haiku, okay, all the way. So my great grandma used to live in Danilovgrad, which is where I'm right now. And so Danilovgrad is a town that is 20 minutes by car from Podgorica, the capital. And if you were to go by feet, it would take you several hours to get there, right? It's about 20 kilometers, 22 kilometers. So it was World War II. Her sons, my grandpa and his brother, were in Podgorica studying, and there was a bombardment of Podgorica, which was, by the way, the second most bombed city after Dresden in World War II. It was demolished, which is why it was rebuilt quickly and in a very efficient way. It's not the most beautiful city in the world, but it's very enjoyable to be in. Anyway, see how much we talk. So my great grandma, Olga, decides to walk to Podgorica to see if her sons are okay after the bombardment. They were at her cousin's. She gets halfway through, runs into a neighbor, starts talking to him. Talking, 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 she starts walking with him. At one point, he says, "Well, Olga, I got home. Where were you going?" So she had gone back home without realizing it because of how much she was talking. So she said, "Oh, no, I was going to Portugal." I said, "Well, I'll go tomorrow." She stayed home. So she did a whole journey back over 10 kilometers, which is 16 miles. No, it's 6 miles.
Yes, 6 miles,
6
6.2
miles.
exactly.
Yes, there you go. So yeah, she did all that, and yeah, we tend to go on and
But I think that's, one of the things that's charming that comes across in your books, that I read, where you get that sense of place and you get that sense of, what makes somewhere unique. And back to Asia, I think that's one of the challenges. I have not spent much time in Japan, and one of the books we talked about recently was butter. And I after I talked to my neighbor who is Japanese, I understood a lot more about the cultural context, particularly the views of women, particularly the self-censorship and the beauty culture and the thinness culture that is pervasive here in the US, but even more so in Japan. And so I feel like with some of these very different cultures from the one that I grew up in or ones that I've traveled extensively in, I do feel like I miss a lot, even when I read a translated work, because obviously I can't read it in its native language, because I'm missing the cultural context, because I'm missing those allusions to great works or allusions to dominant paradigms and dominant themes, so it's still worth reading. I still feel as if I should challenge myself and read authors from different parts of the world, but I do find them harder to connect to sometimes because I'm not of that culture or even familiar enough with that culture to really respond in the way I think the author is trying to get you to respond or relate in the book, and it's not the author's fault. It's basically I don't have that, corresponding resonance in me, of understanding their context.
Yes, but you have the learning moment, which is so priceless. And I remember I've never been to the Far East. I have been in the Middle East, and for instance, even though my two favorite authors are American, as I said, Steinbeck and Faulkner, my favorite book is a book from India. And that book is The God of Small Things
Oh,
by
yeah.
Arundhati Roy. I cried for 50 pages, and then I thought when I reread it, well, okay, now I know what's going to happen. I'm not going to cry. And instead, I cried for 100 pages because I knew what was coming. And every time it was like that. But it's a stunning book. It's an inimitable book, even though many try to imitate the style. It's a unique book, and it didn't try to beautify India. You got to feel as a reader what it's like to grow up in an area like that, in a country like that, in an
Mm.
area like that that's around Kerala. Uh, when I wrote Fathers Before Sons, I had this same issue when people are doing anything, whether it's a book or a movie that's set in Montenegro, they would always present Montenegro in a way that to me was not authentic at all. So it's either a postcard Montenegro that you got to see when you came because we went on all these beautiful boat rides and just tourist excursions, and Montenegro has a lot of that. It's very scenic. However, that is not the reality for people from Montenegro. Then you have a second version that is a very antiquated Montenegro with these people living among the mountains like it's the 17th century, and
Yeah.
it's all very modest and very old-fashioned and caricatural. And that's not my Montenegro either. I don't know it. It's not what we who live in different cities experience. I've never met people who live like that. And then there is a third version, which is also not authentic at all, which is this hyper modern, drug addicted, hysterical youth that just, it looks like you're trying to present a Hollywood version that also has nothing to do with reality. So it mattered to me a lot that Fathers Before Sons be a book where you can see Montenegro as I perceive it, as the majority of us perceives it. And I don't know how much foreign readers are connecting, but people in Montenegro keep telling me that they're finally, uh, first of all, that they keep saying this is exactly who we are, but also something that I loved was that kids who didn't live during the 90s told me, okay, I heard so much about them, but for the first time I got to feel what it's really
Oh,
like.
wow.
So in that, this is not me bragging about my book, it's just me trying to convey that when literature attempts to give a sense of place and a sense of history of that place, it can be a window or a door into a country that otherwise you would come see as a postcard on a yacht or on a boat and then move on with your life and say, oh yeah, Montenegro is so pretty. It is. It's super pretty, but it's also a lot of other things, and it's gone through a lot, and it's going through a lot now. And I think literature is wonderful in conveying that. When it comes to translation, there was an anecdote I wanted to tell you. There are some nightmare stories, okay? So, besides the one that happened here, I met a woman in France, in Paris, who is a translator from French to English and
Mhm.
vice versa. we were in a book club together, and she's talking about how she translates books, and then she says in a very matter-of-fact way, very importantly, when an author has a sentence that's too long, I'm not going to put up with that. I cut it up.
Oh my. Cut it up?
Let's just say that I reacted. Okay. Let's just say that my opinionated side came out.
I
That there
can't
there were
imagine. You?
voices raised a little bit. And I just said, I think you should be stripped of your license to translate or whatever. And I hope to God, if I ever become a famous international star, you are never going to translate anything I write.
Well, I mean,
How
don't put her in front of
dare
James
you?
Joyce. I think Ulysses is literally one sentence. It goes on
How
forever.
dare you touch what that author wrote? I translated Claudio Magri's, an Italian author, from Italian to Montenegrin. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. And he has sentences that are 2 to 3 pages long.
Wow.
It's very, very hard. But you either put up with that sentence and you translate it the way it's meant to be, or you hand it to somebody who can do the job.
Well, I think particularly
Imagine if I chopped him up.
yeah, it would have totally changed the rhythm of the book because
Everything.
clearly
Like,
the
who the hell do you
author
think you
had an
are?
intention about how the cadence of that section should go if he or she bothered to write a sentence that went on for 2 or 3 pages. That's a stylistic choice. That's a
He did not do that by accident.
right.
He did not forget to put a period, okay?
Oh
Who are
my.
you to mess with that? Like, don't do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just, yeah, that offended me deeply, I have to tell you.
I think that, that's a really blunt instrument version. One that comes to mind for me was, reading poetry in different languages because
I don't know how people do that. I don't know how
let's face
people
it,
translate poetry.
English is one of the least rhymable languages, and
That's true.
with any sort of romance language, you have the beauty that a lot of the verbs, specifically will rhyme because they have a very similar structure. And, I struggle with poetry in English just to feel like I'm really understanding the essence of what an author's conveying. And I remember reading poetry in French and poetry in Italian and just thinking to myself, there's no way to make this work because if it rhymes, if it has, these echoes in the poetry, you just can't even create that in English. There is literally no way to accomplish that. I
Yeah,
think
I
that
don't know
really
how people translate poetry. I mean, not the free verse poetry. You can do
no.
whatever you want with that. But the poetry that has the metric, and the rhymes, and
Yeah,
that's a mystery to me. That's such an art form.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think
Yeah, I couldn't do it to save my life, Sue. There's no way.
that's probably the one thing where, even though I'm missing the linguistic nuance, at least I get the sensation the author was trying to create through his or her language, when I read that poem in its native language, and that has a beauty in and of itself, and I can't imagine how hard a translation job it is to try to master all those different angles of poetry and make them even a faint echo of what they are when you put them in a foreign language.
There were, I miss the grand translators from former Yugoslavia because they had some brilliant titles and things they came up with. Now, I don't know how to convey that to English speakers, but for instance, the title Gone with the Wind
Mm,
is wonderfully translated into our language. We didn't use, the translator didn't use gone, but he used a verb that's typical for the wind. It's not blown, but it's another one. It's very poetic. And they didn't say wind, they said a type of wind. So it's a prohujalo s vihorom. It's beautiful. Wuthering Heights was also beautifully translated. And another one, Bugs Bunny. So Bugs Bunny is not translatable into our language. It doesn't mean anything because we don't use the bugs in the same way that you do. And so the translator called him Duško, which is a name. Dugo uško. So uši are ears and dugo is long. So instead of long ears, it's like the long ear boy, like Duško dugo uško, and it rhymes and it's beautiful.
Mhm.
So there were some brilliant cases of translations, but then I haven't seen any of that in a very long time. And that's a shame, but thankfully you guys have an amazing publishing industry that, yes, is a bit restrictive towards certain topics, but is also very open toward others. And the quality of the work that comes out of those publishing houses is enviable. So you're very, very lucky, Sue, because what you read in translation, you're going to read in high quality translation.
Yeah. Though I will kind of make a bridge to one of our future topics. Gone with the Wind is one of the books that has been banned in certain circumstances. So, one of the things that is concerning me greatly right now in the US is how many books are being banned or challenged. And that is not only such a shame for authors like Steinbeck, who's often on the banned books list, but also for kids and I think young adults exploring different dimensions, different identities. One of the best things about reading a book is you develop empathy for characters. A really good book can make you feel deeply about situations you can't experience on your own. And so I think whether you can or can't experience a foreign language and reading that book, you can always experience that empathy for a character if it's a great writer and they can make you feel really deeply about the subject, a place, a person, a situation. And one of my biggest fears is these books that are getting banned are just taking a whole swath of situations and preventing young adults from accessing them, experiencing them, even in their own minds, through, I think, a misbegotten belief that by experiencing them, they will want to become them. And
Uh,
so tragic. So I hope we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about this really fraught topic. I mean, it can be funny at times. Sometimes I found a few books on the banned list where I was thinking to myself, wow, wow, somebody really wanted to protest that book. But some of them are the canons of American literature, like Steinbeck and Faulkner. I found a Faulkner on the banned list too.
which one?
Um, I'll have to go back and look. But
Well, our next topic is definitely
yeah,
that. So we're going to you have to come to tell me because I didn't know that they were banning Faulkner, but well, there's a lot to say about that. But tell me, which book in translation would you recommend to our listeners, viewers?
I would say I go back to where I started with Calvino. The book that I most enjoyed of his is The Castle of Crossed Destinies. So I think if you're a fan of things slightly mystical in your literature, you will get a lot out of that book and enjoy it greatly. What about you,
Okay.
Ksenija?
I'm going to go with something more modern, and I'm going to go to Italy. Well, first of all, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. It's a very unique book. It was more popular when it came out. It won the Booker. Uh, it's very lyrical, but it's very painful, very beautiful, haunting book. But there's an Italian book by a modern author who actually won the Premio Strega, Witch Prize. Witch, you know, the witch on the
Yes.
broom. Yeah, that's the name of the most prestigious Italian book prize and literary prize. And it's called The Solitude of Prime Numbers by
Mm.
Paolo Giordano. It's a modern story. It's quite haunting too. The premise of the book is something that is deeply troubling. It's deeply human. It's painful, but I think it's very, very beautiful. It stayed with me. I read it a long time ago, and I still, when somebody asks me to recommend something that's written in Italian, translated obviously into many, many languages, including my own, I recommend that one because I think it's truly special.
Excellent.
Now, before we go, I have a correction to make from last week. I actually wrote it and pinned the comment under our YouTube video, but not everyone is listening to us through YouTube. So when I was talking about how we were talking about compromises that artists make, and just do we judge them through the opinions they have? And I said that Tolstoy, I wasn't sure if it was Tolstoy, had very virulent anti-Semitic views that he expressed in his journals. Wasn't also, it was Dostoevsky.
Sì, yeah.
Yes. So Dostoevsky was strongly anti-Semitic, didn't hide it at all. And yet we don't take that into consideration when we consider who we're going to ignore or not ignore, judge or not judge, because of the beliefs they held 100 years ago or 80 years ago or 200 years ago. And so that's when we were talking a bit about our hypocrisy, how we ban some and we don't ban others. I've never heard anyone on the internet say, "Do not read
Dostoevsky.
Dostoevsky," because Dostoevsky was anti-Semitic, and he really was. So, wanted to
Fascinating.
make that correction because poor Lev Tolstoy had been accused wrongly by me, and we're not going to stand for that.
Absolutely not. Oh,
Heck no. All righty.
excellent.
Well, thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Sue. And please do subscribe. Please do recommend us. We're brand new. People don't know about us. We want them to hear about us organically. So help us out in that way. And
And if you have a great
that's it.
translation you like or a foreign author you think you should recommend to us, please add it to the comments.
Exactly. Thank you and see you next week. Bye.
Bye.